Hello, I'm Chuck Wolf, Chief Executive for Charles J. Wolf Associates, LLC. As a motivational speaker and a leadership consultant and executive coach and trainer, I often work with very successful people in their companies. Since many can't afford a professional, I volunteer to host a radio talk show called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel, on a nonprofit community radio station in Bridgeport, Connecticut, WPKN. My reason for doing the show is to share with as many people as possible this wonderful process for helping people manage their own emotions and their relationships with others. My goal is for everyone listening to learn to use the Emotion Roadmap to make life better. As you listen to me, help others, I hope you are also learning. As a Simsbury resident, I'm delighted to be able to make the show available through Simsbury TV. To learn more, go to my website, www.emotionroadmap.com. Thank you for listening and watching.
Hello, this is Chuck Wolf. You're listening to the Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel on WPKN 89.5 FM, listener-supported radio. Last time I was on the air, I played part one of a Harvard alumni panel discussion where I brought together some of the world's leading thinkers and researchers and practitioners in the field of emotional intelligence. The show last time featured Carrie Chernis and Helen Reese. Today's show will feature Richard Boyatzis, a professor at Case Western and also a very successful world-class consultant who has specialized in competencies and in emotional intelligence. He worked collaboratively with Dan Goleman and others in the field, and he is considered one of the world's leading experts. Before I introduce Richard, I just want to tell a little story to connect my work with the work that Richard is doing. And then we'll hear from Richard. And at the end, after Richard finishes, we're going to listen to a few other comments, closing comments from Carrie Chernis and Helen Reese, the two other panelists that took part on the Harvard panel on emotional intelligence on January 11th, 2021. Thank you.
A few years ago, I was working in Albany for Kaiser Permanente. It's a very large health maintenance organization, some of you may know. And it had an operation at the time in Albany, in the Albany area in New York. And the IT group was working to include a new health maintenance organization that Kaiser had bought. And they were trying to merge the systems, and all the people were working. You've probably seen information technology workers do this at times. They were working 7 days a week, really long hours. They were kind of very stressed, but they were challenged by the work, and they liked the work, and they liked the operation, and they really liked Gary, the fellow that was leading it. But he could see that burnout was around the corner. And so one of the things he said, you know what, I'm going to have to take a day, and I'd like to spend that day with them trying to understand what they'd like to feel, what their future might look like if we can create the kind of workplace where they're going to really be happy. And I'd like Chuck, your help in doing this. And so when I came in, I worked with them to help to create a vision. And the thing that they looked at and that they said that was unique. So I've done a lot of vision work. And one of the things that they said that was unique was we want to work in a place where we, our teammates, our leaders, all of our employees, and our families, they use the word flourish. And I'd never seen the word flourish in the workplace before, and I'd never seen it quite used like this. And then they started to describe what it looked like if they would be flourishing, because they weren't flourishing at the time that they thought this.
And all of a sudden, you could see the emotional change of tone and the excitement that came.
As they started to think about the intentional change they want to make, and that leads me to Richard. This was, at least to me, a way of thinking about some of the work that I had done that sort of lent itself to when I read your work, Richard, some of the thoughts that I had. So Richard Boyatzis is Distinguished University Professor of Case Western Reserve University, Professor in the Departments of Organizational Behavior, Psychology, and Cognitive Science, and H.R. Horvitz Professor of Family Business. He is a B.S. in Aeronautics and Astronomics from MIT, a M.S. and Ph.D. in Social Psychology from Harvard University. Using his intentional change theory, he studies sustained desired change of individuals, teams, organizations, communities, and countries since 1967. He is the author of more than 200 articles and 9 books on leadership, competencies, emotional intelligence, competency development, coaching, neuroscience, and management education, including the international bestseller, Primal Leadership with Daniel Goleman and Annie McKee, and the recent Helping People Change with Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Oyston. His Coursera MOOCs, including Inspiring Leadership Through Emotional Intelligence, has over 1 million enrolled from 215 countries, which is just amazing, I think. He's fellow of the Association of Psychological Science, the Society of International and Organizational Psychology, and the American Psychological Association. And about Richard, I would also say he is great company. He's a lot of fun, and he's really fun. It's been really a wonderful opportunity to get to know and learn from you, Richard. So I'm glad you could be here, and now you're up.
Thank you very much, Chuck. It's really hard following Helen and Carrie. I remember once I was doing a keynote at an annual meeting of the UN Food Program directors in Dublin. And, we had all the discussions beforehand about what I was going to talk about in my keynote and some exercises I was going to run. And it wasn't until I showed up in Dublin that I found out who was preceding. And I was talking about people being inspirational leaders and all this, only to discover that the person who was speaking before me was Nelson Mandela. So it was, it's like that moment. I feel humbled. But at any rate, my exploration of this all started in my 6.5-month career of designing interplanetary vehicles, because that's what I studied to do. And that's how long I lasted at Northrop Norrair in California doing this kind of research. Because what I discovered was managers were really inept at getting people interested, excited, or able to do something. If I jump ahead to 1970, I did the first competency study in which we looked at outstanding performers versus modest or average performers versus poor performers. And with Dave McClelland and two people from PDI, Marv Dennett and Rob Silzer, and a consultant, Pat McLagan, I guess the five of us are usually seen as the people who created the competency movement in human resources. But the key was that I was asked, as one of the more junior folks of the group, small group of us, to tackle this thing of explaining why some of these, in this first study was on supervisory chaplains in the Navy, why some of them were outstanding in their impact and others just couldn't get off the ground. And that led to a lot of these studies, always anchored on performance effectiveness. I've been a part personally of hundreds of these at my former company, McBurr, which then was merged with the Hay Group and now Korn Ferry, and colleagues at other universities around the world, and Carrie among them. We've done probably several thousand of these studies in almost every country of the world. And one of the things I want to start with is the observation that 70 to 80% of the people in management and leadership positions, from sales branch managers to CEOs of public, private, and nonprofit organizations, aren't adding value. They can be taken out of that managerial or leadership role, and the organization would function more smoothly. Now, I'm saying this as the teaser because before I close my comments, I'm going to give you 3 things that you could be doing if you're not already. Some of you may be, but 3 things you could be doing to dramatically increase the impact you're having on having your organization innovate and produce. But it starts with this notion that when we would look at the outstanding versus average, whether we're looking at in big companies, and some of our early companies we looked at did a lot of studies for General Electric and American Express and even Digital Equipment in the 70s. But they also included various groups in the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, State Department, and a lot of organizations in other countries and other governments. It became very clear that the majority of these behaviors, these competencies, which are sets of behaviors with an underlying intent, really had to do with how people were either managing themselves or managing their relationships. And when my first book on the data from 12 of these large organizations came out in 1982. I remember Howard Gardner had one of his books, his main introduction of the multiple intelligence came out about the same year. Maybe it was exactly 82. And I remember talking to Howard about it because he had this thing where two of the intelligences, one was intrapersonal, how somebody was managing themselves, and one was interpersonal. And I was very struck by that. I also, by the way, really liked one of the intelligences he had, which was kinetic. Decades later, my parents are immigrants from Greece. I spoke English is actually my second language, and but in my youth, I was quite conversational, but I lost it. So in the 90s, I wanted to get back to speaking Greek. So I started studying it every time I'd go to the health club at Case Western and working out. And I did 45 minutes on the Stairmaster as a part of my routine. So, I'd be listening to tapes, speaking the thing, reading pieces. And it doesn't strike me how powerful kinetic intelligence was until my wife and I were in the island of Rhodes and in this one area called Lindos, going to this temple, which is way at the top of a hill. And I forgot something. I put one of the camera bags down and I forgot it. And I said, whoops, and I ran and grabbed the camera bag. I found it and I ran back up the stairs to where my wife was waiting. And she said something to me. I answered her in fluent Greek. And she said, whoa, it was because I was running upstairs. Anyway, back to Howard Gardner. It led to the realization that the vast majority of these capabilities, although there are always certain critical thinking, cognitive competencies, 80 to 90% of all the competencies that differentiate performance were either about the self or about the relationships. And it's one of the reasons why when, Dan's book came out in 95, Dan and I were in our PhD program together and we were close personal friends as well as in our classes together. But I remember him at the time calling me and saying, hey, you're the one who's actually doing this research and you've got the training. Let's make it work. So I think emotional intelligence is really two different things. There's how you're handling your own emotions, but there's also how you're handling the emotions of others in the terms of relationships. Now, I'm not going to say much more about emotional intelligence or social intelligence. Helen has explained empathy in more ways than most normal people will ever really grasp. And a lot of the other things you understand. You understand what adaptability is, emotional self-control. You understand what influence is, or being inspirational. What I want to do is what I've been spending a lot of my time on. I mean, I still do research on the emotional and social intelligence and the methodological work and all that kind of stuff. But it's really in the use of it that I think most of us have an interest. And that's where my work in the last 20 or 22 years has really focused on how do people use it, not just in leadership, because that was almost a duh. As John Cotter said back in the 80s, people at the head of an organization manage people who 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 actually do the work. And that means that, anybody with half a brain realizes that as soon as you're in a top executive position, you're not managing a budget. You're not managing a strategic plan. You're not managing any of those things. You're managing people who are enacting, creating, or doing all of this. So the central theme that I really turned to in, even though I did my thesis on unconscious drives on intimacy back in the early 70s, what I'm going to talk about today is where my work in the last 22 years is focused on, which is how do you motivate others? How do you help people be open to learning and change? And I think that right now, the engagement, pre-COVID, the engagement crisis everywhere in the world is telling us that we have a huge motivation crisis. People just don't want to continually use their capabilities. And that's where we really can shine. but it's going to take some things that are a bit counterintuitive. Before I get into the arguments about what that would do, let me just say, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the research because you can read about it either in cursory terms in English, or you could, get copies of the things. But what I'm about to talk about is based on 39 published longitudinal behavior change studies, 3 fMRI studies we've done, and 2 hormonal studies. So we're looking at both what produces sustainable change in people's behavior, and we're focusing on emotional and social intelligence behaviors, and what is the internal mechanism? What's going on in people's minds and bodies that enables it? So before we look at that, let's do a little exercise. How can we do a whole hour and a half on emotional intelligence and not do something with emotions? So here's the exercise. I want you to think, get a piece of paper out if it helps, and a writing implement. I want you to think about who has helped you the most in your life become who you are or get to where you are. Who are the people who you would say, I wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for X and Y. I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for person Z. Just give yourself a moment, write down a few names. Sorry to interrupt the list you're generating, but because we're time constrained, go back to the first person you thought of and remember a moment in which you learned something important from them. Now, I mean, if it was a mother or father, there would have been hundreds, if not thousands of these, but let your memory filter to one that'll jump out and replay the video in your head briefly. What did they say or do? How did it make you feel? Just see if you can do that for the first person on your list. I'll go silent for a while and let you reflect on that. Now, normally, I would give people more time on this, and I would have people break up in pairs or trios and talk about this. We don't have the space or the time. But let me say the question I want to ask, and I can't, we don't have a mechanism for me to actually hear from you in this case, but is to answer the question, how did it feel remembering these people, writing down their names, thinking of a moment? How did it feel right now in doing that? Now, I know it's dramatic. Only a few of you have your videos on live, but it was interesting to me that almost half of the people whose videos are on screen were smiling when they were doing this. So either you were reading something funny or it was the memories. Sandra, you're nodding your head, suggesting the exercise. And I think Lois, you did too, and Will. I've done this exercise in all 7 continents, about 65 countries, and it doesn't matter where we're in Astana, Kazakhstan, or Milano, or Cleveland. People will often say, well, I felt really grateful. I felt like somebody loved me. I felt honored, respected, seen. And it was very, very moving, very humbling to me. Sometimes people will say, I felt really nostalgic, by code for word for sad, because the person's passed away and they miss them. People will say, I felt excited and lifted, or I felt centered. And part of the magic of this is that if you had any of those feelings, not all, any of those, you spent a few moments in the parasympathetic nervous system, which, by the way, is the only physiological system that allows you to combat the ravages of chronic, annoying stress. So, one question for you to think about later tonight and maybe tomorrow: whose list will you be on? That's our legacy, folks. I mean, there's two ways to have a legacy in life. One, you can donate a lot of money to a really great university, like Harvard, or you can really have key relationships. Of course, I'm joking. And as a professor, I'm paid to say the first thing. But so this is what we've been studying. What we've been studying is how people typically help others. Remember, I told you that's how I got into the field of psychology. I was absolutely frustrated with these. I was in a group of scientists at Northrop. We were all working on spaceships in 1966 and 67. It was kind of like two departments of Sheldon's, if you follow Big Bang Theory. And I couldn't believe how inept the managers were, in terms of getting ideas from us and getting us excited about what we were doing. I mean, it contrasted with a project manager I had at MIT in September of 1964, who got me involved as a freshman in working on calibrating lasers for the navigation system of the Lunar Excursion Module. That guy was phenomenal at really getting us excited about what we were doing. So what we began to discover is that most of the time when we try to help someone, whether as a manager or as a leader, as a teacher, as a physician, as a nurse, as a parent, we actually spend more of our time trying to get them to do something we want them to do. And Melvin Smith and I started writing about this in 2002. And we said, this is really coaching for compliance. You want this other person, and usually it's out of good intentions, but you want them to do what you want them to do. And what we started to discover is that when you do that, you always activate the body's stress response, the sympathetic nervous system. You make people defensive. It could be mild, could be extreme. And you very often become a helping bully. When people use their emotional and social intelligence, they engage people at a whole different level. And we've been calling this coaching with compassion. We use compassion not in the sense that Helen was using. We actually use the Confucian interpretation of feeling for others in pain, as Helen suggested, as part of empathy, but also feeling for others in joy. So it's people who have a problem and people who want to grow. It actually, I like to say it comes from Aristotle, but truth be told, Confucius wrote about it 200 years earlier. So although I usually like to claim most good ideas came from the Greeks, this is one case where I think it came from the Chinese before they created the COVID virus. So here sorry, I'm just joking around. I don't do Twitter, and you could see why. I'd be crucified all the time if I did. But the reality is, when we compare people who excite others, who open them up, who create organizations that come up with innovative products after innovative products. Bill Gates and Ballmer were horrible CEOs of Microsoft. I've had this validated by VPs of HR at Microsoft. They were brilliant, and certainly Bill Gates is a phenomenal philanthropist, but they were horrible executive leaders because they used to crucify people whenever they came in with ideas because they would critique it. Nadella is turning Microsoft on. They're more innovative in the last 3 years, than they had been in the 20 or 30 years before that, I think. So the magic is, how do you open people up? Well, we call this coaching with compassion. And the idea is you have a stress response in your body, which is a hormonal system, sympathetic, and you have the parasympathetic. When you activate the parasympathetic, people are open to new ideas and other people. Under a stress response, everybody, every gender, every race, every ethnicity, under stress, people are cognitively, emotionally, and perceptually impaired, period, because we have too much of it. And I'm even talking about too much of annoying stress, not the less, today where everybody is as Helen was talking about and Carrie was talking about. I mean, everybody today is under a lot of acute stress as well as annoying stress. And then if you're in a leadership position, you have power stress. So here we have this dichotomy. On top of that, we also know that neurologically, there are some major networks in the brain that we use all the time. One of them is the analytic that you use to solve problems or analyze something or make a decision. And another one is called the empathic network by Tony Jack. It's really historically called the default mode network. And that's a network where you're scanning the environment, open to new ideas, and by the way, open to other people. The problem is these two networks suppress each other. They're antagonistic. So I finally had, from about 2006 to 3 years ago, in the studies I was doing, the neuroimaging studies, but then others that Tony Jack was doing, got evidence for why I'd been saying since the 70s, show me a leader who starts a meeting with financials and I'll show you an ineffective leader. I mean, look, financials are important. I built and ran 2 consulting companies for 11 years with several hundred geeky PhDs in them, but I also, I like money. I mean, I don't like to spend it. I like to make it more. It's just kind of a game thing. But the idea is, I'm not dissing financials. I'm dissing the fact that a lot of executives think it's motivating to talk about numbers. So here are a couple revelations. The most important thing you can do with a group of people, if you want to motivate them to be open and to use their capability to really want to be there, is to focus on the dream, the vision, the sense of purpose, the shared vision, not goals. Some of my research published in 1972 empirical studies showed that goal setting was important for behavior change. In the 90s, it became clear to me that that wasn't working too well. By 15 years ago, I then had the data to show why. When you spend time trying to motivate people with specific goals, more dashboards, and all this kind of stuff, you continually activate what I call the negative emotional attractor, which is this analytic network in the brain. And it closes people down. I mean, they've shown that the peripheral vision of people under this activation goes from 180 degrees, which is what most of us have peripheral vision, down to about 30 degrees. People stop scanning the environment. You have what's called competition neglect in the strategy field. All of these things go on when you focus on goals and objectives and dashboards, thinking you're motivating people, when what you're really doing is making everybody feel guilty and defensive. Now, goals have a place in resource acquisition, but except for salespeople and people high in the unconscious drive of need for achievement in terms of McClellan's things, everybody else is turned off to specific goals. And it's one of the things that makes a lot of things that we try go awry, especially in leadership and management. Second, you want to create a balance between these two attractors, the positive and negative. You need the analytic, you need the empathic networks in the brain. You have to make decisions, you have to solve problems, but you have to be open to ideas and people. You need the stress. If you didn't have stress, you wouldn't have stayed awake this long, assuming those of you with just your name on the screen are. But you need the parasympathetic nervous system to rebuild your body, literally allowing stem cells in your brain to become new neurons. You need the balance. And to learn the balance, you don't do both at the same time because all of these systems in our bodies are antagonistic. So what you have to learn is a facility for moving back and forth for yourself first. And that's why an article that we just had published is called Thrive and Survive, How to Manage This Balance of Personal Sustainability. But as Chuck was explaining in part of his example, it's also how do you stimulate that in others? How do you help others learn to go back and forth? And then how do you build quality of relationships? All of this about emotional and social intelligence is for naught if you can't convert it into relationships. And, folks working with me, a lot of doctoral students for the past 13, 14 years have been focusing on the properties of shared vision, shared compassion and caring, and shared energy. And we've got data, I think there's 37 or 38 doctoral dissertations showing family business success financially, innovation, development of family business leaders, bank executives, better treatment adherence in terms of type 2 diabetics, if the physicians establish these relationships, and IT managers, even engineers, they don't have to be managers. So a huge amount of data saying the quality of the relationships really matters. And if you're more philosophical or like the classics, although I enjoyed reading his work, especially Italiano, is Niccolo Machiavelli really was not a good model for what we need and want in this day and age. Cicero had a much better insight to that. We want to be loved. We want to be cared for. We want to care for others. And as a result, I think that if we focus on the dreams and then the goals later, dreams being shared purpose, if we focus on the balance of back and forth, it's one of the things that people sometimes, you could use it through mindfulness work. You could do it through caring for others and helping people less fortunate, especially the elderly, especially elderly professors. It's important that you help elderly professors. You can do it through hope, and you can do it through playfulness. So there are a lot of techniques for the balance. And then building these caring relationships and spending the energy to invest in the relationships. And then you'll find magic happens.
Thank you, Richard. I hope you all have enjoyed this.
I do want to just, first of all, thank Richard and Helen and Carrie and Alex for allowing us to put this on for you. I hope you've gotten some real value. Again, these are some of the smartest people out there about different areas and aspects of this field of emotional intelligence. I hope it's broadened your view. One of the things I'd like to say, I was going to spend a few minutes just talking about this concept I call an emotion roadmap. It was in the late 1990s. I had the chance to work with Peter Salovey, again, he's president of EO at this point. At that time, he was chairman of the psychology department, and Jack Mayer and David Caruso. And the three of them actually looked at this ability-based model, and they were trying to understand how do they make it operational and practical and useful. And one of the things that I've discovered over the years that I've been working with people is that when smart people are stuck, when really good critical thinkers and problem solvers that usually have no issues at all solving problems can't solve a problem, what I've found is it's almost always something emotional is happening inside, either you and or the other persons that you're dealing with. And if you think about your own situations, if there's any place in your life right now where you're stuck personally, where you can't decide how to move forward, you're feeling uncertain, confused, concerned maybe about escalation, if it's something that involves conflict, if you're really stuck, it's almost always something emotional is happening. And when I worked with Peter and Jack and David, it seemed to me one of the things I could do was use another Greek. The Socratic Method showed up in my head. It was like, I need to turn this into a series of questions. And I thought maybe the questions are, what is it you're feeling? And if the feelings, as I came to understand, drive your thoughts and behaviors, if your feelings aren't helpful, then what would be ideal to feel? And if you are not feeling what's ideal to feel for what you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to get done, what would be ideal? And how do you get from, let's say, feeling anxious to feeling confident? How do you do that? How does that happen? And so I spent a lot of years working in that field in that way. And I know we're out of time pretty much, and I want to allow just a few questions if we have time. So I'm going to stop. I will say this, though. I want to talk about at least one leader that I work with who really seemed to get this right from the start. One of the things that he does as a leader, and I think this is a really good example, is that he's always interested in new information. In fact, I talked to him tonight and shared a really interesting idea around how you create an intervention for diversity and inclusion. Actually came from our consortium. Just one of our other members talked about it. But one of the things that I wanted to say about him was I wanted to let him know about a new study that had come out of the Cornell Hotel Management School that was about what it takes for really high-level resorts to generate premium profits with guests, and the kind of loyalty, it's almost like evangelical loyalty, where people just you can't believe the place I just went to. It's such a wonderful place to stay or to eat or to be entertained. And it was welcome, comfortable, and important. Those were the emotions that show up when you go to a hotel yourself. If you feel welcome and you are made to feel comfortable and you feel like everybody there thinks of you as important and you're treated that way, you want to come back, is what the research showed. And when I went to show that to him and talk to him about using this research with his people, he said, Chuck, that's a great idea, but let me, instead of focusing on the guest component, let's do this when we teach about it with internal groupings of bellmen, of housekeeping people, of the front desk, of financial people, of the human resource team. Let's bring them in their respective groups and ask them, do they feel welcome, comfortable, and important? Because he was someone who knew that if you have your staff, when your staff deals with guests in a frontline way, as most hotel people do, and they're feeling welcome, comfortable, important, that's what your guest satisfaction scores are going to show. And he's an award-winning manager and leader in that industry. His name's John Caparella. If you want to know more about the work that I do, you can go to my website, emotionroadmap.com, and see a lot of information. You can also go to the eiconsortium.org website and see the interviews I've done with Richard about his book, and Helen about an earlier book, and Carrie about his more recent book, and also some of the other interviews. And I'd encourage you, if you're interested in emotional intelligence from a parenting and a school perspective, one of our colleagues is a fellow named Mark Brackett. Mark's a friend, and he and I started off when he first started in schools doing the work he's doing that's called Ruler. He's the director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And Mark is offering a free book club. You got to buy his book, I guess, and read his book, Permission to Feel, which is also on the website, an interview with Mark about his book. It's a great book, but you can join with Mark. It's starting January 21. Just go to markbrackett.com. That's another way to learn about parenting and dealing with children. So let me just ask if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat room. And if there are, I'll take one or two as best I can before we close out. I see some chats, but they're not questions, just thanks. You're welcome. It's been such a pleasure to do this. And I think, we're right pretty much at the end. And so I don't know, Alex, are you there? And if you want to say just some closing words, you can jump in at this point.
This is Alex.
Oh, okay.
I'd just like to say thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. And of course, thank you to Chuck and all of the panelists. We really appreciate your participation and your insights. I will echo some of the comments I'm seeing in the chat, which is we have a lot of reading to do, and it may break my nightstand from all the extra weight of books that I now have to put there to read up on all these different subjects. But I learned a lot, and to Chuck's first point, I think it's opened up our eyes to all of these various avenues that we can now pursue to expand our knowledge around emotional intelligence. And I'm really excited about continuing this journey. On behalf of the HBS Club of Connecticut, thank you everyone for joining. I encourage you to check out the resources of our panelists, and I will be following up with an email and links to these various resources.
Thanks, Alex. Somebody did ask one question. They asked, is self-awareness the foundation? I'd say self-awareness gets you to the point where you're aware, but then you got to do something about it. And Richard, you want to say something? You got something real quick you want to say?
Anxiety is what drives the stress response. It's one of the many things that does. And really good levels of emotional intelligence or social intelligence enable you to ameliorate it through the parasympathetic nervous system. So they really are quite opposite. But the question of, is self-awareness the path to emotional intelligence and social intelligence? Yes, but not always. And Dan Goldman and I kind of disagree on this a little bit. I mean, he feels that self-awareness is always the starting point. I think it's very useful for certain people. But I have now realized there are a whole bunch of us out there who either don't have the learning style or tolerance to spend time, or the lack of defensiveness to look inside. But when we care for others, when we stop and try to work with others and take care of them or motivate them, we very often can use that as well to a path to more emotional and social intelligence. So I actually think there's two different ways to get to it. I think
Well,
Helen would agree with me if you.
Thanks, Richard. I just add this. I just add that one of the things that Dan Goleman said in our consortium meeting a while back, and at first it hit me. It hit me a little funny. It was empathic concern. It was this idea that if you, empathy is like you have this cognitive empathy. You know why people feel a certain way, and emotional empathy. You feel what other people feel, and it doesn't really matter unless you're concerned about how other people feel. And so that really rung a note with me. Helen, did you want to say something?
When we perceive these emotions in other people, it acts to motivate empathic concern. That is the loop that comes out. And then we decide, are we going to act with compassion? So empathic concern is completely wired into our perception of other people's suffering. If we have the capacity for affective empathy, and we realize not everybody does.
Thanks, Helen. Carrie, would you like to say something before we close here?
Yeah, I just sort of finishing up the discussion about empathy and empathic concern. The strategy that the outstanding leaders that we studied used most often to try and activate their empathy was to put themselves in the other's shoes. So that's an example of a strategy which even people who are very high in empathy sometimes find it can be very helpful in order to activate that empathy, because sometimes it's not always so easy. And we're seeing that, I think, a lot in the recent week or two in this country.
Well, thanks, everyone. Again, thank the panelists. And it's fun to see people that I've seen, recognize old friends and recent colleagues. And Lois, say hello to your mother. James, I'm glad you could make it. Sarah, thank you for the kind note in the chat room. And Len, hope you enjoyed it. And Deborah, thank you for your kind note as well. So everybody, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a really lovely time. I'm going to sign off now and say goodbye and good night. And thanks again for being here. And I'll put it out on YouTube. If you want to know how to get a link to it, you can contact me at cjwolf@cjwolfwithane.com. Take care, everybody.
That concludes the panel discussion that we had on January 11th. So I'm editing this a later date after the inauguration. And I want to offer a few thoughts about what's taken place during the month of January, because we've had some really interesting experiences, some extremely challenging and some more recently very unifying. On the one hand, we had the episode that triggered so many people's fears and anxiety when we had people actually break in and attack the Capitol. It was a horrific day and a very, very scary time. And many of us wondered, what can we do about it? How do we address it? And can we at all do anything? Are we powerless or are we powerful? And then we had the inauguration, which, thank goodness, went extremely peacefully. And I have to say that Amanda Gordon, the Harvard alumnus that had that wonderful poem, the National Poet Laureate, who had that wonderful poem that was so moving and so inspirational. If you haven't heard it, I suggest you find it on YouTube, because her words and images and ability to juxtapose images and words together in ways that were just astounding were really inspiring to so many people. She really received many, many wonderful comments. And I encourage you to listen to her poetry and her poem and to be inspired by it. I also want to let you know that there are organizations that are working very hard as hard as possible as volunteers, as some paid staff, to actually make our politics, our emotional climate in this country better. So while the discussion at the Harvard panel was why interest in emotional intelligence is soaring and how powerful emotional intelligence can be, I think it is time for all people who are able to participate in trying to generate a more respectful, civil, emotionally sound culture in our country. It's time to pull together as best we can by understanding and valuing our differences. It's time to look forward. It's time to find common ground. And some groups that I'll be talking about more in the future include one group I've been very active in for a long time, No Labels. And I have to say that the No Labels group is a volunteer organization. You can find out about them at nolabels.org. You can email me if you want to get involved, because I'm very involved in that in Connecticut and in the throughout the United States. Actually, I've taken a somewhat important role as a volunteer for their organization. So you can contact me at cjwolfe@cjwolfe.com. And No Labels is having an impact on problem solvers. And you're hearing a lot more about the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress. I believe it's 56 members right now, half Republican, half Democrat. Each of them partnered with one person from the other party, partnered. And they have pledged to put country over party. They're going to do what's right for the country and not be persuaded by their party to vote against the country's interest. Now, it may seem crazy to think that parties do that, but they do. And these people feel enormous pressure sometimes if they want to be reelected and have support from their party to go along with the party line. And in this case, in this caucus, these people take a pledge to put country first. That's one organization. And they're very impactful with the actual legislators and with the senator, the congressmen and the senators now, because there's a common sense coalition forming. They're working as a bicameral, but with the two houses of Congress getting together to try and find ways to move bipartisanship forward. And you will have noted that they were extremely effective in bucking their party's leadership. Both the Democrat and Republican party's leadership didn't support the COVID package that actually did get completed not too long ago, the $900 billion package. If you remember, if you saw this, you saw senators and congresspeople up on stage without party leader support saying it's unconscionable to go home for the Christmas holidays without passing some kind of package that supports the great need that American people have. And because of their efforts, something got done. And there's more to come. They're already working very closely with the Biden administration, I'm very pleased to say. So I'm very proud to be active in that role, and maybe you would like to be involved as well. And the second group, and I'll be talking about them in the future, is a group called Braver Angels. And Braver Angels works a little differently. They are not so involved with the elected officials as they are with trying to help increase civil discourse by having people they call reds and blues learn to listen to understand each other's very different perspectives. And in the near future, I hope to have the director of media for Braver Angels, a person I've gotten to know and talk with, a man named John Wood, to talk with us about the Braver Angels organization. I was on a call for them, with them the other night, a virtual town hall sort of. It was a 2-hour presentation. It was a little long, honestly, but it featured some amazing people talking about their perspectives and the way they see things and the way that they've come to understand how Braver Angels is making the United States a lot better place to be because of their efforts. if you're interested, I can send you some recordings. Again, you have my email address of some of the conversations that took place on that presentation. They're on YouTube, and I have some excerpts that are extremely powerful that I'd be happy to send you if you like. And again, I'll be talking with them, so you'll be learning a little bit more about them. I think it's really important as we look at emotional intelligence and the ways it can impact us going forward in the future is simply to think about how do we control our own emotions and how do we influence the emotions of others in very positive ways that make a meaningful difference for each of us, for those we love, and for all the other people who might be on the other side of the way we think, the way we look, the way we pray, all kinds of differences. How do we make life better for all of us? How do we do this together? And so let me share with you a couple of the speakers that were featured. And by the way, this particular virtual meeting had 4,500 people on video call into this. That's pretty amazing for a volunteer organization. In any case, there was Dean Phillips, who is a Democrat, House of Representative elected official, and Dean was actually in the Capitol building walking as he was recording. And this was shortly after the events that happened on January 6th. And so, again, a very powerful, moving moment. And I'm happy to share that tape with you. He's also a governor who is a very bipartisan governor who was also speaking with him at the time. And that's part of the feature with Dean Phillips. And the governor's Republican, and he has some really nice things to say. And then there's this brilliant pastor, Reverend Franklin Ruff, R-U-F-F, who is a black man who talks about his conservatism in a very profound way. And I found it very inspirational. He's leans red. He's moderate. He serves a group in his congregation that, range from far blue to far-leaning blues to far-leaning reds. And so he needs to moderate all of them together. And he said one of the people in the congregation called him. This is a very, sort of far to the left leaning blue in his congregation, a good friend of his, who called him right after the events of January 6th and said he was very disturbed. He was very upset. He was very upset about all those people who supported President Trump and all those people who attacked the Capitol building. And he went on to say how all of them are xenophobes, homophobes, and all kinds of phobes, and went on for a while saying all these things about this group. And then the Reverend said to him, but I'm a conservative and I support this president. And he said, yeah, but you're different. He said, and you think that's okay to say that I'm different? Well, yes, you're not the same as all of them. And he said, well, okay. Now, having said that, let me just ask you this. Now, if you had said to me that all black men are thuggish, they're lazy, they're criminals, and he went on to say other things. And he said, but you, Reverend, you're different. He said, is that okay? And he said, it caused my friend to stop and think differently about putting entire groups of people in categories that they may belong to in part, but that doesn't mean that some of the bad behavior associated with that category fits them all. It's powerful messaging, and Braver Angels does some amazing things. That was, I'm happy to share those videos, and seeing it by the people who are presenting it, as opposed to me telling you about it, I think might actually move you as well. So I encourage you to find out more about No Labels and about Braver Angels. And if you're interested in joining either organization and you're from Connecticut, you feel free to contact me. If you're from other states and listening to this, then I suggest that you just look up the nolabels.org and braverangels.org. Thanks. And with that, I'll close. And thank you all again for listening. You've been listening to the Emotion Roadmap. Take the wheel and control how you feel. This is Chuck Wolf. You're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM, WPKN.org if you're listening on the internet. And if you'd like to hear some of my past shows, including hearing this one again, I'm going to feature it on SoundCloud and also on the Public Radio Exchange and iTunes. Take care, everybody. I'll talk to you next time I'm on the air. It's the first and second Wednesdays of each month. The first and second Wednesdays of each month at 12 noon Eastern. Bye-bye.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.